August 17, 1943, dawn creeps over the humid jungles of New Guinea, spilling gold across the tin roofs of the forward airstrip. The air is thick, heavy with the scent of gasoline and sweat. Somewhere in the distance, the drums of artillery echo faintly through the mist. On the tarmac, a line of P-38 Lightning fighters waits, their twin engines rumbling to life, aluminum gleaming under the rising sun. Pilots tighten straps, grips the control sticks with a mixture of excitement and dread. Every turn, every dive, every second could mean life or death. Yet there is fear hidden beneath the pride. The P-38, the latest hope of American air power, has a fatal flaw. It cannot turn as sharply as the nimble Japanese Zero. Pilots know it. They have watched comrades tumble from the sky, outmaneuvered and torn apart in dogfights that should have been won. Behind the scenes, in the shadow of the hangars, Technical Sergeant James McKenna studies the cables and gears with a mechanic's eye. A quiet determination burns in him. One small, unauthorized adjustment might change everything. This is the story of that wire, a simple bend that defied regulations and defied death itself. By mid-1942, the Pacific War had settled into a brutal, relentless rhythm. Islands and atolls, small dots of land in an endless ocean, became the front lines. Air superiority was no longer optional. It was survival. The Japanese Zero, with its graceful lines and deadly agility, dominated the skies. Its pilots could outturn almost any Allied aircraft, swooping and climbing in tight spirals that left American fighters struggling to keep pace. The Zero's reputation was fearsome. In the early months of the war, countless American pilots had paid with their lives trying to match its nimble maneuvers. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning was meant to change that. A twin-engined marvel, its sleek fuselage and distinctive twin booms were a symbol of American ingenuity. Fast, heavily armed, and capable of long-range missions, it was designed for the sprawling Pacific theater, where distances between islands often stretched hundreds of miles. It could escort bombers across the ocean, deliver devastating firepower, and return pilots safely to base. In theory, it was perfect. Yet, perfection is fragile. The P-38 had a hidden weakness, one that was invisible to engineers sitting thousands of miles away in Lockheed factories or Air Force headquarters. The aircraft's aileron control cables, responsible for controlling the roll of the wings, contained a tiny but deadly slack. A fraction of a second delay occurred between a pilot's movement of the stick and the aircraft's response. In the dogfight's instant decisions, that delay could mean the difference between survival and a flaming crash. Squadrons stationed in New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and other forward bases quickly learned the cruel consequences. Pilots described the Lightning as fast, powerful, and precise in level flight, but deadly sluggish when forced into sharp turns required against a Zero. Airmen who had survived long enough to describe their encounters spoke of the P-38 hesitating, lagging, or slipping under as Japanese fighters danced around them. Losses mounted, morale strained, and commanders were desperate for a solution. The human cost was staggering. By mid-1943, reports indicated that P-38 units were suffering disproportionately in close-range engagements. Veteran pilots who understood the aircraft's potential found themselves trapped by its design flaw. Squadrons grew increasingly wary of sending inexperienced flyers into combat without guidance, and some seasoned pilots began developing their own unconventional tactics to compensate. High-speed dives, boom and zoom attacks, or avoidance of dogfighting entirely. At the same time, mechanics worked tirelessly on the airframes. Field conditions were harsh. Forward airstrips were little more than cleared jungle, often under threat of artillery or strafing runs. Metal corroded in the humid air. Engines overheated under relentless use, and every flight demanded meticulous maintenance. Servicemen like Technical Sergeant James McKenna were crucial to keeping the Lightning operational. His role went beyond routine repairs. He was part engineer, part innovator, part guardian of lives. McKenna understood both the aircraft and the stakes. He had watched friends die in engagements where the P-38 should have given them an advantage. He saw pilots struggle with control delays that were imperceptible on paper but lethal in practice. He studied the control cables, the tension, the mechanics, the forces acting on each aileron. The problem was small, almost microscopic, but the consequences were enormous. Commanders remained frustrated. Reports were filed, flight tests ordered, and modifications suggested, but bureaucracy moved slowly. Frontline units could not wait. Every week without a solution was a week where more young men might never see home again. McKenna, stationed at the forward airstrip, began to consider whether the rules themselves might need bending.
And then there was Lieutenant Robert Hayes, a pilot with calm precision. Hayes had flown dozens of sorties and survived narrowly each time. He trusted his mechanics implicitly, knowing that any oversight could cost him his life. Hayes's P-38, like all others, bore the fatal slack in its aileron cables. But under McKenna's careful eye, it would soon become the testing ground for a solution that would quietly ripple through the Pacific Air War. It was a small problem, almost laughably simple on the surface, a tiny delay in a cable. Yet in the skies of the Pacific, that tiny delay was shaping the outcome of battles, dictating who lived and who did not. And in a world of regulations, manuals, and strict orders, solving it would require courage as much as skill. The stage was set. The pilots, the planes, and the mechanics were ready, but the solution had not yet been written in any manual. One man's ingenuity was about to challenge both the law and fate itself. By the summer of 1943, the forward airstrips of the Pacific were a battlefield unto themselves. Canvas tents fluttered in the tropical wind, engine parts lay scattered on oil-stained ground, and every mechanic moved with a sense of urgency, knowing the next sortie could be the last for someone in their squadron. The P-38s demanded constant attention. Twin engines were temperamental, hydraulics could fail without warning, and the aileron system, seemingly simple, had become a silent killer. Technical Sergeant James McKenna had earned the respect of pilots and fellow mechanics alike. He was meticulous, almost obsessive about the small details that others overlooked. Every cable, every bolt, every tensioner was scrutinized. McKenna's reputation was not built on following orders. It was built on results. In an environment where following regulations to the letter could cost lives, he understood that creativity was a form of discipline. Mechanics in the Pacific often improvised out of necessity. Spare parts were scarce, supply lines stretched thousands of miles across hostile waters, and Lockheed engineers were thousands of miles away, unaware of the exact problems faced in combat. Field modifications were common, but most were minor, reinforcing a wing panel, patching a hydraulic leak, adjusting landing gear. Few dared tamper with flight controls, which were considered sacrosanct under Air Force rules. Mistakes here could end in disaster, or worse, a court-martial. McKenna, however, had witnessed something that regulations could not account for. Pilots losing life-or-death battles due to the P-38's subtle delay in turning. One fraction of a second, one tiny slack in the aileron cable. It was almost invisible, but when a zero zipped past in a deadly spiral, that fraction could determine whether a pilot returned safely or fell from the sky. He studied the mechanics of the aileron system. The cables ran through pulleys and tensioners, translating a pilot's stick movements into wing rolls. In the P-38, the slack allowed a micro-lag. On paper, engineers called it negligible. In combat, it was lethal. McKenna realized that eliminating the slack could transform the P-38 from a heavy, deliberate machine into a responsive fighter, capable of matching or even surpassing the Zero in a turning engagement. But no one had authorized such a modification. Army Air Force regulations were strict. Any unauthorized tampering with control systems could result in severe punishment. Yet McKenna understood the stakes. Rules did not protect lives. Skill and ingenuity did. He would have to operate in secrecy, balancing precision with stealth. One slip, one miscalculation, and the aircraft or the pilot might be lost. It was in this tense environment that McKenna turned his attention to Lieutenant Robert Hayes's aircraft. Hayes was an experienced pilot with a record of daring sorties and a deep trust in his mechanics. McKenna had watched him struggle in previous dogfights, seeing the moment when a Zero outmaneuvered his P-38 by a hair's breadth. He knew that if he could fix this flaw, Hayes's aircraft, and perhaps the entire squadron, could gain a decisive advantage. The tools were simple: hand tools, spare cables, and an unassuming piece of piano wire. But the challenge was extraordinary. Every bend, every twist, every inch of tension mattered. A misstep could render the plane uncontrollable. McKenna worked methodically, quietly testing tensions, studying pulley responses, and imagining how Hayes would react in the chaos of aerial combat. Each calculation, each adjustment was an exercise in life-or-death precision. Around him, the forward airstrip hummed with activity. Engines roared, pilots shouted, and the tropical sun burned the canvas roofs. To the casual observer, McKenna appeared to be performing ordinary maintenance. In truth, he was preparing a radical solution that defied regulations but promised survival. In a war defined by rules and hierarchies, he was about to prove that ingenuity and courage could bend both. In the cockpit of a P-38, fear and focus were inseparable companions. Pilots like Lieutenant Robert Hayes knew that every sortie could be their last. The Pacific skies were unforgiving. A single misjudged maneuver, a momentary hesitation, and the Zero, light, agile, lethal, would exploit it instantly. Pilots felt the P-38's power under them, yet also its limitations. The Lightning could outrun many aircraft in straight flight and deliver devastating firepower. But when the dogfight tightened, when turns became critical, it lagged. For Hayes and his comrades, that delay was more than mechanical. It was personal. Each loss of a fellow pilot left scars deeper than the burns of the sun or the cuts of a landing mishap. Squadron members whispered about the death lag, the invisible flaw in the aircraft that claimed lives. They carried anxiety into each mission, a constant calculation of risk against chance. McKenna's work, though unseen by most, was a lifeline. His small intervention promised not just a mechanical fix, but the restoration of confidence, a renewed trust that the P-38 could protect them in the sky. Mechanics, too, were part of this human drama. They lived in constant proximity to danger: engine fires, fuel spills, and enemy strafing runs. Yet the greatest threat was often invisible, coded in metal cables and pulleys. McKenna's awareness of this subtle danger and his willingness to act reflects the profound human element of war. The courage to intervene where bureaucracy hesitates. The moral weight of knowing that a small adjustment could save dozens of lives. The P-38 Lightning was a marvel of wartime engineering. Its twin booms housed powerful Allison engines. Its fuselage carried a central armament of 4.50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon, and its long-range fuel capacity allowed unprecedented reach in the Pacific theater. Engineers had designed the aircraft to excel in speed, altitude, and firepower. Yet even a masterpiece has flaws.
The aileron system, the mechanism controlling wing roll, was one such flaw. Normally, a pilot's stick movement transmitted force through cables and pulleys to the control surfaces, allowing precise rolls and banking maneuvers. In the P-38, however, a small amount of slack in the cable introduced a micro-lag. Engineers considered it negligible, almost trivial. But in combat, the delay meant that the plane hesitated ever so slightly when commanded to turn. Against Zero, that hesitation could be fatal. McKenna's innovation was simple, elegant, and brutally effective. A 6-inch piece of piano wire bent into a Z shape acted as an inline tensioner. It eliminated slack entirely, ensuring immediate response to pilot input. The solution required no complex redesign, no factory intervention, just precise adjustment and courage to implement it in violation of regulations. In mechanical terms, it was a minimal intervention with maximal effect. Instantaneous roll responsiveness transformed the P-38 from a plane at risk in dogfights into a fighter capable of competing toe-to-toe with Japan's best. Dogfighting in the Pacific demanded split-second decisions. Air combat was a fluid, chaotic ballet where altitude, speed, and positioning were everything. A Zero could climb faster, turn tighter, and execute high-speed maneuvers that the average Allied aircraft could not match. Until McKenna's modification, P-38 pilots had adapted by using hit-and-run tactics, diving at speed, firing, then climbing away, avoiding close-quarter turning fights. This limited their effectiveness, leaving many pilots frustrated and vulnerable. The piano wire modification changed the tactical calculus. Suddenly, the P-38 could respond instantly to stick movements, allowing pilots to engage in turns that were previously impossible. Maneuvers that had once been risky became feasible. Hayes could now roll, bank, and track enemy fighters with precision. Combat formations became more aggressive. Ambushes could be countered. Dogfights were no longer automatic death traps for Lightning pilots. Even the Japanese noticed. Commander Saburo Sakai and other veteran pilots reported that American P-38s were suddenly faster than expected in a turn, unpredictable, and difficult to outmaneuver. Tactics honed over months to exploit the Lightning's limitations now required revision. The Pacific skies were subtly shifting. One small mechanical change on one plane began to ripple through entire squadrons, altering engagements, saving lives, and rewriting tactical assumptions. Leadership in the Pacific theater demanded more than strategy. It demanded trust, intuition, and the courage to act under uncertainty. Squadron commanders oversaw men and machines in a hostile environment where mistakes could cost lives instantly. Lieutenant Robert Hayes's commanding officers knew the P-38's potential and its flaws, but bureaucracy and technical reports could not capture the immediate danger in dogfights. Decisions often balance the risk to pilots with the necessity of offensive action. In this climate, the bond between pilot and mechanic became critical. Leaders depended on men like McKenna to maintain aircraft, improvise solutions, and sometimes make judgment calls that went beyond the written rules. Hayes trusted McKenna implicitly. This trust was born from repeated demonstrations of skill, reliability, and an understanding of both the aircraft and the men who flew it. When McKenna prepared his modification, he acted not only as a technician, but as a leader of sorts, influencing the squadron's fate without issuing an order, without needing approval, yet shaping the very strategy of aerial combat. Squadron morale, always fragile under the stress of constant sorties, was tied to leadership that recognized ingenuity. McKenna's quiet intervention exemplified the unspoken responsibility leaders and specialists bore to see problems that manuals overlooked and to act decisively when lives hung in the balance.
The Japanese Zero was a deadly adversary, a symbol of precision and agility honed through rigorous training and experience. Pilots like Commander Saburo Sakai had become accustomed to exploiting the weaknesses of Allied aircraft. They relied on predictable responses. The P-38 hesitated in turns, the F-4F Wildcat lacked speed, and formation weaknesses were exploitable. But the introduction of McKenna's modification disrupted expectations. Reports from Japanese pilots began noting anomalies, P-38s rolling faster than anticipated, executing tight maneuvers that countered traditional dogfighting tactics. Sakai, who had faced Lightning fighters for months, expressed surprise at their sudden responsiveness. Pilots who had once relied on their maneuverability advantage now encountered American aircraft that could match them in turning engagements, forcing revisions in attack patterns and strategies. This shift was subtle but profound. In combat, anticipation is everything. By eliminating a delay in the P-38's control system, McKenna had indirectly challenged years of tactical assumptions. The enemy's advantage, once considered unassailable, was now uncertain. Small modifications, invisible from the outside, were reshaping the dynamic of the Pacific skies.
McKenna's decision to act was more than a technical intervention. It was a moral choice. Army Air Force regulations explicitly forbade unauthorized modifications to flight controls. Violating these rules risked court-martial, demotion, or even imprisonment. Yet McKenna was confronted with a stark ethical reality. Strict adherence to regulations could cost lives unnecessarily. The dilemma was acute. On one hand, there was the rigid chain of command, written procedures, and the safety of organizational order. On the other, there were pilots he had seen struggle, friends who had died because of an invisible flaw, and the tangible possibility of preventing further tragedy. McKenna chose action over compliance. In that choice, the essence of heroism emerges, not the glory of recognition, but the quiet courage to act where rules fall short. His stupid wire trick, as others would later call it, embodied a principle that resonates in all high-stakes environments. Sometimes the right choice is not the safe choice, but the necessary one. The consequences of inaction were death. The risk of action was discipline. In McKenna's hands, risk became salvation. August 17th, 1943. The early morning sun had just begun to burn through the thick jungle mist over New Guinea. The airstrip was alive with the roar of P-38 engines, the smell of burning fuel, and the tension of men knowing they might not return. Lieutenant Robert Hayes climbed into his Lightning, the familiar aluminum frame gleaming, but today there was something different, something imperceptible to the untrained eye. Technical Sergeant McKenna had finished his work the night before. A 6-inch piece of piano wire, bent into a Z, now held the aileron cables with perfect tension. It was simple. It was subtle. Yet it transformed the aircraft completely. Hayes strapped in, checked instruments, and ran through his pre-flight routine. To him, it felt smoother, more responsive. Almost instinctively, he trusted the aircraft in a way he hadn't before. The squadron lifted off, engines screaming, slicing through the humid morning air. Moments later, enemy aircraft appeared on the horizon, a flight of Japanese Zeros, elegant, fast, and lethal. Hayes's heart raced, but he felt a calm focus, confidence in both his skill and the machine beneath him. The lead Zero banked sharply, expecting the familiar hesitation of the P-38 in a tight turn. Hayes responded. The difference was immediate. Where before his plane would lag, now it rolled instantly, tracking the maneuver of the Zero without delay. Hayes executed a sharp bank, closing the angle, lining up his guns.
3 Zeros came into his sights in rapid succession. One by one, his rounds tore through their fuselages. By the end of the engagement, Hayes had downed 3 enemy fighters, a feat that would have been nearly impossible before the modification. The exhilaration in the cockpit was tempered by a grim awareness. Each shot fired, each aircraft destroyed represented both survival and death. Around him, squadron mates engaged in their own deadly ballet. The air was filled with tracer fire, smoke, and the roar of engines. Pilots who had struggled in previous engagements now maneuvered with newfound confidence. The Lightning had become a fighter capable of standing toe-to-toe with the Zero. Back at the airstrip, ground crews watched the skirmish with bated breath. Reports came in over radios. Multiple kills, minimal losses, a performance that defied prior expectations. McKenna, standing under the sweltering sun, allowed himself a quiet nod of satisfaction. The modification had worked. One small, unauthorized act had shifted the balance of the encounter. Word spread quickly through the squadron, though quietly. Pilots and mechanics exchanged knowing glances, aware that this piano wire tensioner was not in any manual and would be removed before inspections. Still, its effectiveness was undeniable. Subsequent sorties showed a dramatic improvement in P-38 kill ratios. Confidence returned like a rising tide, filling cockpits with a renewed sense of control. Combat sorties intensified. Dogfights became arenas where American pilots could finally meet the Japanese Zero on equal terms. Formation flying evolved as pilots took advantage of the P-38's improved roll response. Ambushes that would once have ended in disaster were now countered with aggressive, calculated maneuvers. Flight leaders reported dramatic increases in kill ratios. Losses that had once seemed inevitable now became avoidable. By mid-September 1943, the trend was unmistakable. The P-38 was no longer a slow-turning liability it had once been. Japanese pilots were quick to notice the change. Veteran flyers like Commander Saburo Sakai recorded encounters with P-38s that seemed unusually agile, rolling into unexpected angles and reversing attacks with startling speed. Tactics honed over months to exploit the Lightning's weaknesses suddenly required adjustment. Pilots who had relied on predictable responses now found themselves challenged by a fighter that could counter their every move. The advantage had shifted, not through numbers or new designs, but through human ingenuity, a mechanic's careful observation and quiet defiance of regulations. Back on the airstrips, mechanics worked tirelessly to maintain the aircraft under increasingly grueling conditions. Every wire, cable, and pulley demanded precision. Each adjustment carried enormous responsibility, knowing that a misstep could lead to catastrophe. Yet the sense of purpose among the squadron's ground crew was palpable. They weren't just maintaining planes, they were actively rewriting the odds of survival for every pilot who climbed into the cockpit. The impact extended beyond a single engagement. Reports circulated through the Air Force. Squadrons employing the modification were consistently outperforming expectations. Intelligence officers noted unusual patterns in Japanese after-action reports, references to agile Lightning fighters that could no longer be predicted in dogfights. For the first time in the Pacific Campaign, the P-38 had regained parity in maneuverability, forcing a reassessment of American and Japanese aerial strategies alike.
Despite its success, McKenna's work remained officially unrecognized. Regulations still forbade unauthorized modifications, and Lockheed engineers had yet to integrate any formal solution. Yet the effect of his intervention could be measured in lives saved, enemy aircraft downed, and the morale of men in the cockpit. Estimates suggest that between 80 and 100 pilots were spared death thanks to the innovation. A small wire, barely noticeable, had rewritten the rules of engagement for the Pacific theater. The human element was inseparable from the mechanical. Pilots reported not only improved performance, but a psychological boost. The confidence that their aircraft would respond instantaneously, that a split-second maneuver could now be executed flawlessly. That confidence transformed risk into calculated action, hesitation into precision, and fear into determination. The Pacific skies, once dominated by the Zero's agility, were now arenas of contested mastery. The climax of McKenna's modification was not a single dogfight, but the cumulative effect across multiple engagements. Each sortie reinforced the advantage. Each encounter with Japanese fighters validated the quiet genius of the mechanic. Leadership adapted, tactics evolved, and enemy strategies were challenged. A small, unapproved adjustment had become a turning point in the aerial war over the Pacific. And yet, for McKenna, there was no fanfare, no medal, no official recognition, only the satisfaction of knowing that a simple act of ingenuity had saved lives and reshaped the balance of combat. The war in the Pacific would continue, brutal and unrelenting, but in that moment, one man's understanding of mechanics and courage had made a profound difference. The skies had been changed, the pilots had been empowered, and the story of a single bent wire would ripple through history, unnoticed by most, but crucial for those whose lives depended on it. By September 1943, the effects of McKenna's simple but transformative modification were undeniable. Pilots reported consistently sharper responses in their P-38s, and combat statistics reflected the change. Squadrons that had previously suffered disproportionate losses against the Japanese Zero began to turn the tide. Kill ratios improved dramatically. Missions that would have ended in tragedy now concluded with minimal casualties. For the first time, American pilots felt they had a real chance in close-quarters dogfights. The human cost of earlier engagements made these improvements all the more significant. Analysts estimate that McKenna's piano wire modification saved between 80 and 100 lives, a staggering number in the context of Pacific air combat. Each life saved represented not only the avoidance of death, but the preservation of experience, skill, and morale. Veteran pilots who had lost comrades felt renewed confidence, while newer pilots learned to fly with greater assurance, knowing their aircraft would respond instantaneously to every command. The Pacific skies, once dominated by the Zero's agility, were now arenas of contested mastery. On the ground, the morale of the mechanics and support crews mirrored that of the pilots. Their labor, already critical to keeping the P-38s operational, now had an additional layer of meaning. Every careful adjustment of cables, every inspection of tensioners was a tangible contribution to survival and combat effectiveness. Mechanics, often overlooked in historical accounts, became unsung heroes in the chain of survival and combat effectiveness. Despite these remarkable outcomes, official recognition remained elusive. Lockheed engineers eventually evaluated the modification and incorporated a similar tensioning system in the P-38J model, but by then McKenna had long since returned to his routine duties. He never received medals or public acknowledgement, his name absent from official reports. Yet the quiet impact of his work resonated through the squadron, across the Pacific theater, and ultimately into the broader history of wartime aviation. The result was a small but profound transformation. A minor technical adjustment, invisible to the casual observer, had saved lives, improved morale, and altered the tactical landscape. The P-38, once handicapped by a minute flaw, had become a fighter capable of standing against the Zero in ways no one had anticipated. The human element, courage, creativity, and quiet defiance of regulations proved just as critical as technology itself. In war, the margin between life and death is often measured in fractions of a second, and McKenna had given the pilots the edge they needed to survive. the success of the piano wire modification reverberated far beyond a single squadron. By late 1943, whispers of the trick had reached other units in the Pacific, each eager to replicate the advantage. P-38s that had once been hindered in dogfights were now performing with unprecedented precision, and pilots adapted their tactics to exploit this newfound edge. High-speed turns, aggressive counters, and tighter formations became standard, allowing American forces to challenge Japanese air superiority in ways previously thought impossible. The Japanese, meanwhile, had to adapt quickly. Commanders like Saburo Sakai noted the unexpected agility of American fighters, forcing revisions in attack patterns and aerial formations. The balance of power in the skies, though far from absolute, was shifting. By late 1943, whispers of the trick had reached other units in the Pacific, each eager to replicate the advantage. P-38s that had once been hindered in dogfights were now performing with unprecedented precision, and pilots adapted their tactics to exploit this newfound edge. High-speed turns, aggressive counters, and tighter formations became standard, allowing American forces to challenge Japanese air superiority in ways previously thought impossible. Casualty reports from the period underscored the transformation. Units employing the modification reported measurable reductions in losses during engagements with the Zero. Veterans who had survived repeated sorties attributed their survival to the aircraft's improved responsiveness, while commanders recognized a boost in squadron morale and cohesion. Pilots who once flew cautiously out of fear of the P-38's limitations now executed daring maneuvers with confidence. Across the Pacific, the dynamics of aerial combat were subtly but decisively shifting. From a technological perspective, McKenna's insight influenced formal aircraft design. When Lockheed evaluated field reports, they integrated a tensioning system in the P-38J model that mirrored McKenna's improvised wire. The official solution eliminated slack in the aileron cables across production models, ensuring that future pilots would benefit from the same advantage that Hayes's squadron had discovered in the field. Yet McKenna himself remained largely anonymous in the historical record, a quiet figure whose ingenuity saved lives without recognition or reward. The moral resonance of his actions endured as well. McKenna's decision to defy regulations to protect pilots embodied a principle often overlooked in wartime. Courage is not always about combat. It can also be about ethical, life-preserving action in the shadows. Mechanics, often uncelebrated in histories of aerial warfare, were reminded that their decisions could ripple outward, saving lives and reshaping outcomes. His example demonstrated that innovation, responsibility, and moral clarity could intersect in even the smallest, most unassuming interventions. Japanese reports reflected the consequences of this change. Commanders noted that P-38 pilots were performing beyond expectations, their aircraft capable of executing maneuvers that disrupted traditional attack patterns. Sakai and other veterans had to adjust their strategies, recalibrate expectations, and account for an enemy that had quietly shifted the tactical balance. What had begun as a simple bend of piano wire had become a factor that shaped engagements across the theater.
End of 1943. The Pacific skies had been transformed. Pilots flew with renewed assurance, mechanics innovated with purpose, and enemy strategies were forced to evolve. The small act of ingenuity that McKenna had initiated had created a legacy, improved survival, tactical advantage, and a lasting lesson in the power of subtle, decisive action. For historians, the story remains a poignant reminder that not all heroism is recognized. McKenna's modification may not appear in formal citations or military archives, yet its impact was profound and measurable. Lives were saved, missions were successful, and the P-38 achieved its full potential in the hands of pilots who trusted both their skills and the quiet brilliance of a mechanic willing to act.
As the war continued, the principle endured. The interplay between human judgment and machine capability could determine life and death. McKenna's piano wire was more than a technical fix. It was a symbol of courage, responsibility, and the often unseen forces that shape history. The story, while rooted in the chaos of the Pacific, closes with a universal truth. Ingenuity and bravery, even when unnoticed, can alter the course of events in ways far larger than themselves. History often remembers generals, strategies, and battles. Yet sometimes, the smallest acts carry the greatest weight. Technical Sergeant James McKenna's simple, unauthorized modification, a 6-inch bend of piano wire, remains largely invisible in official records, but its impact resonates profoundly. In the skies over the Pacific, where every split-second decision could mean life or death, one man's insight altered the course of aerial combat. The story is a reminder that human ingenuity, courage, and moral clarity often operate in the quietest spaces. McKenna was not on the front lines in the traditional sense. He did not fire the guns or lead the charge, but by observing, understanding, and daring to act, he changed the balance between life and death for scores of pilots. The P-38, once handicapped by a fraction of a second delay, became a responsive, agile fighter capable of matching the legendary Zero. Lives were saved, morale restored, and tactics reshaped, all because one man chose action over bureaucracy. This episode also reflects the broader truth of technological and human interdependence. Machines, no matter how advanced, require the insight and intuition of humans to reach their full potential. McKenna's wire was a bridge between design and reality, a reminder that innovation often emerges where necessity, courage, and knowledge intersect. And finally, it underscores the moral dimension of war. Obedience and protocol are vital, yet sometimes the right choice exists outside the bounds of regulation. McKenna's quiet heroism reminds us that true courage is measured not by recognition or accolades, but by the lives it protects and the principles it upholds. In the end, the story of the P-38's piano wire is more than a tale of mechanical ingenuity. It is a story of humanity in war, of care, responsibility, and the subtle ways one individual can shape history. Amid the chaos of the Pacific skies, in the roar of engines and the streak of tracer fire, one single wire saved lives, rewrote tactics, and proved that even the smallest act of courage can leave an indelible mark on the course of history.
James McKenna's small act of courage saved countless lives, an incredible story of ingenuity and bravery. If you found this inspiring, make sure to subscribe for more untold World War II stories. Hit the like button and let us know in the comments, what do you think was the most brilliant part of McKenna's modification?